Hey guys, this is my home. This is where I grew up, right in Port Sydney, Muskoka. It's a bit north of Barrie, if any of you have been there. It's quite a beautiful place. This is Mary Lake, and today I'm just showing you a bit around where I live. And so, welcome to Port Sydney. So this is the view from my house. It's out there. So I live pretty close to the lake, my dad, I guess, lives pretty close to the lake. Now I live in London. But yeah, it's a very nice place. We're really blessed to live in this really great environment. It's all mostly woods around us and forest, and it's just so much beauty to behold. So I've really enjoyed living here my whole life. And anyways, so this one here, I'm just quickly going to show you my house, or where I grew up. Right here. Oh, there we go. There's my house, and
Hi, this is Mr. B. I just went down the falls and it was quite fun. Today we are finishing up our decimals unit, and we're just gonna have a lesson here. But first, you gotta watch me shoot down the falls. Okay, see you guys.
Goedemorgen, this is Sean, and we are going to be learning about some more decimal stuff and just the fun things that we've been doing. Today we're going to be working with just these normal colors. I think they're the nicest. And so we're just going to, first off, we're going to be reviewing, and then we're going to get into division. So we did multiplication last week on Thursday, I believe, and now we're just going to continue here, and we're going to learn about dividing later. But first, just a quick review so that we're all on the same page here. So when I say multiplying by 10, what happens to a number? So we talked about this last week. If you are dealing with a decimal and you multiply it by 10, the decimal place moves this way to the right. So the number gets bigger. Right, so you get 1.0, and if you times this by 10, what happens? You get 10, no? And so that's I'm going to ditch the accent there. So that's kind of what happens. As you multiply by 10, the decimal space always moves over, and what's happening to the right, and what's happening is the place values are growing by 10. So if you have 10. We know that just from when we add them, right? That once you reach 10, you go over. So basically, the place values move. So when we times 1/10 by 10, well, that gives us 10 tenths. And that'll give us 1 whole. If we times 1 whole by 10, well, that's going to give us 10. Because if you add 10 ones together, you get 10. And the same is true if you have 10 times 10, you get 100, right? That equals 100. And so it's always growing the numbers. So that is really important. So when multiplying by 10, the place values grow by 10. And so 1s times 10 is 10s. 10 ones make a 10. And so that's really important for us to remember. So we did that last week. And now if I were to say what is, instead of doing times 10, we say times 100. What happens here? Well, just very much the same thing, though now it's like bigger. And I think the way we described this last week is that this is sort of the same thing as saying times 10 and then times 10 again. And so if you times, let's take a number like this, 0.0349, right? And you times it by 10, what's going to happen? Well, the decimal place is going to move over once. And so you're going to be left with 3.59. And then you take 3.59 and you times that by 10. And that's going to leave you with what? Well, the decimal place will move over again, and you'll be left with 35.9. And so with hundreds, and 10 times 10, right? So, and well, yeah, let me show you. So if you take 0.359 and you times that by 100, you'll get the same thing, because instead of just going over it once, like times 10, that's times 10, and then it's again times 10, and really that's kind of the same as timesing by 100, and so that'll equal the same thing, 35.9, and that's what you get when you multiply by 100. The decimal place was here, moved over once, moved over twice. And then finally, last but not least, hopefully we can erase all that, we talked about 1,000. Now 1,000 is, again, it's a very similar concept, and you could think of it in much the same way, right? So 1,000 is really like 10 times 10 times 10. That's actually why the name of this unit, or this lesson, is actually multiplying and dividing decimals by powers of 10, because 1,000 is a power of 10. You'll get more into that later in math, but yeah, you can see that these are that 1,000 is just like times 10 times 10 times 10. And similar thing happens. So if we had a number like 0.549, we times that by 10, we're going to get 5.49. You take 5.49, you times that by 10, you're going to get 54.9. And then you times 54.9 times 10, and then you're going to get 549. And ultimately, this is the same as doing 0.549 times 1,000. The decimal place is going to move not just once, like times 10, not just twice, like times 100, but 3 times, like times 1,000, right? And it'll go here. And so that decimal place is going to move all the way over, and you're going to get 549, and then you could just put the 0 there just to kind of show it if you wanted to show that the decimal was here, moved over, moved over, moved over. And as we're talking about this, what's actually happening more is that each one of these numbers is growing by 1,000, right? And we can look at it here. If you have 5/10, you times that by 10, you're going to get 50 tenths. And for every 10 tenths you have a whole. And there we have 5 wholes. And hundredths are the same. For every 10 hundredths you have for every 10 hundredths you have 10. You have a tenth. So if you have 40 hundredths, because 4 times 10 would be 40 hundredths, then you actually have 4 tenths. And then the 9 and the thousandths, same thing. If you have 1,000th and you times it by 10, then you have 10 thousandths, and you would have you'd have 100th. And so 9 thousandths times 10, it gives you 90 hundredths. And then for every 90 thousandths, and for every 10 thousandths you have a hundredth, and that's why we have 9 in the hundreds. And it's the same thing for all the others times 100. It's growing by more than by the other one. Anyways, so today we're going to start looking at the opposite. Now this is pretty basic. Once you grasp it, I think you'll understand it. So if you divide 10 by 10, so 10 divided by 10, what do you actually get? Well, you get 1, right? So there are 10 ones in 10. If you break 10 into 10 parts, you're going to get 1, right? And that's true, right? Because it's made out of 10 ones. So if you do 100, right? 100 divided by 10, you get 10, right? Because there's 10 parts in 100. There's 10 tens in 100. So you break 100 into 10 parts, you get a 10. And now, what about this though? If you do 1 divided by 10, now that we know about tenths and everything, what would be there? Well, you would actually have 0.1, right? 1 divided by 10 gives you 1/10, because 10 tenths make up a 1 whole. And so, yeah, and what do you maybe notice here is actually that the decimal point, when you divide, is actually going the other way. It goes left. Remember, division and multiplication are kind of like the opposites. They're sort of opposite of each other. And so, yeah, you have to be cognizant of that. And so, really, this is the same thing, right? You divide 10 by 10 and it goes over 1. And if you you could just have the decimal here and then a 0, right? And you could have the 0 and just say that the decimal moved over 1. And here, you could just say, look, the decimal was like kind of there, sort of invisible, and it just moved over 1 to the left now. So it's going to the left instead of the right. When we multiply, right, by 10, it goes over 1 to the right. When we divide by 10, it goes 1 over to the left. And so, yeah, that's really kind of important to know. So, yeah, when we're dividing, we're doing the opposite of multiplying, right? So 10 times 10 equals 100. And then if we take 100, divide by 10, we kind of reverse it and we get back to 10. So yeah, that's kind of does the opposite. And that's what we see here, the same with regards to decimals. So yeah, that's really important to figure out. I think you would notice that the same, well, let's do a whole number. Well, we kind of already did that actually. So we'll just do an example here. Let's just see if I can pull it down. Okay, so we'll just look at this, like 34.25. Divide that by 10. Well, let's actually look at it first. If we were going to do 34.25 and we were going to multiply it by 10, what would happen? Well, we know that the decimal would go backwards like this. So we'd actually end up with 342.5. But with division, it goes the other way. It goes this way. Remember, if it's division, we go to the left. And you can kind of remember this by the fact that you're going to be making the number smaller when you're dividing. So if this is your number that you're going to be dividing, you're going to be making it smaller. So 34.25 divided by 10 is actually going to be 3.425. And really the same thing is actually happening here as before, that you're taking 30 and you're dividing it by 10, and you'll know that there'll be 3, right? If you divide 30 into equal parts, you'll have 3 left over. And so 4 to 5, right? So the decimal was here and it moved over this way, and in this one the decimal was here, moved over that way. So division does the opposite of multiplication. We'll do one more just to get this concrete, because this is kind of the baseline. I think once you understand this, you'll understand all the others. So divide by 10 equals what? Well, if you've been following along here, you're going to know that when we're dividing, we're going to go to the left, and it'll actually be 1.45. And so that's all that happened. It was there, it went over here one step when you divide by 10. Now when you divide by 100, can anyone guess what will happen? So if you have 0.58 and you multiply this by 100, what do we know what will happen? Well, you're going to get this decimal not only to move once, right? Because we talked about that it's like 10 times 10. It's like almost like timing it by 2 tens. So that would be like timing it by 1 10. And this will be like timing it by 2 tens, which is like timing it by 100. So it moves over 2 spaces. So you're going to have 58.0. Now we just put this, you don't always have to write the 0. This is just kind of to give you the idea of where the decimal moved. It moved over 1, it moved over twice, and there it is. Now, if we have 58 and we divide this by 100, what do we think is going to happen? Well, this decimal is going to go not just one time over, but 2 places over. So that's going to equal 0.58. And you can see that dividing kind of undoes what multiplication does. So if you times something by 100 and then you divide it by 100, you're going to get back to where you started. It's just like if you have 7 and you add 1 and you subtract 1, you're going to still be at 7. And so it's the same thing. If you times something by 100 and you divide by 100, you go back to where you started. So yeah, that's really good to know. And we can the main thing is that when you multiply, decimal moves to the right. When you divide, the decimal moves to the left. When you multiply by 100, the decimal moves 2 places to the right. When you divide by 100, the decimal moves 2 places to the left. So now let's just look at this thing. Oh, that's ahead there. Dividing whole numbers by 10 and 100. So let's just take 67 here. And so this is like normally how we would write a number, right? This is how you normally see numbers, just a flat 67. If it doesn't have any partial numbers, this is kind of what you get. 67 apples or whatever. And now say you wanted to divide this by 10. Well, when we look at this number, some of us might get a little bit confused, and that's totally all right. Like, it can understandably cause some confusion. That's because we don't see a decimal here, right? So we kind of aren't really totally sure what we should do. But fear not, because 67 is really similar to saying 67.0. And I've kind of shown this in the past, even in today's lesson. I often put this there just to help. That this is equal to the same. This is saying there's 6 tenths, 7 ones, and nothing else. And this one's saying there's 6 tenths, 7 ones, and nothing else really, because the 0 basically is saying nothing. But the important thing to remember is that between the ones column and the tenths column, or I guess always after the ones, there's sort of an invisible decimal there. Even if it's not written, it's sort of there. And so you can remember, you can always remember that it is always right there beside the ones column. So that is how you can help you find it where it is. And once we know that, it's easy, right? If you just see 67 divided by 10, right? Well, if we know the decimal's there, we're just going to move it over 1, right? And then it's 6.7. And then if we instead said 67 divided by 100, right, what would we do? Well, we know that because this is the ones column, that the decimal is invisible, but it's right here. And we go over here, and once, and then twice, right? So that would now leave you with 0.67. And yeah, exactly, right? So that's the main idea, that if you're dealing with whole numbers, sometimes you won't see the decimal point when they're asking you the question, but you still have to be able to figure out where it is. And the trick is just to know that beside the ones column, or the ones place value, there's always a sort of invisible decimal, kind of breaking apart the below ones from the above ones. So that's great. And now finally, just some strategies for remembering. Multiplication always makes bigger and division always makes smaller. So right, 67 is bigger than 6.7. And so when you're dividing, you know that your number is going to get smaller. And when the decimal moves, your number should be getting smaller. And so when dividing, the decimal is always going to move to the left. When you multiply, the decimal is always going to move to the right. And so now that's important to remember. Also, that if you want to remember, for every 0 in the amount you're multiplying by, right? If it's whether it's 10 or 100 or 1,000 or even greater, right? With 10, you move over 1 space. With 100, you move over 2 spaces, and with 1,000, you move over 3 spaces. So these are helpful for remembering how you do it. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I was happy to bring it to you, and yeah, I really hope that today's work goes well. Bye bye for now, guys.